Thanks, along with the slides. Erica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Erica Chavez, and I'm with the Colorado Public Health Association, and I am doing this webinar with Lindsay. We did one previously. I don't know if anybody heard that, but we're going to be doing this one together today again.
Yes, we have some repeat viewers and listeners, so thank you for supporting COSOPHE and CPHA. I'm the president of COSOPHE. In our other lives, Erica and I both practice law, although in different capacities. And we're excited to talk to you today about the newly proposed, or two of the newly proposed FDA food-related rules. Just so that you know, we will send out the slides after the presentation, so that will go out in a blast email to all of you.
And we're going to have some time reserved at the end for questions, so we know that you guys are going to have some questions as we go through. If you can save that to the end of the presentation, that would be wonderful.
And with that, I think we'll just give you a brief overview. Erica's going to talk about some history and some things that have prompted where we are now with these new rules. And then I will kick it off with a discussion of one of the two sets of newly proposed rules. In the registration materials, we told you which one we would be covering, and that's still the one that we will cover. Although at the end of the presentation, there are additional slides that talk about the second set of rules, which you may find helpful. And we don't expect to get to those, but we wanted to provide the information. So with that, unless anyone has any technical issues they want to raise, please note that you can use the chat function on the lower left-hand part of your screen to ask us questions. Under Select Chat Recipient, you can designate the presenter or chairperson. With that, I'm going to let Erica kick it off.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit. I'm just going to give you a broad overview of the FDA and some history. The FDA being the oldest comprehensive consumer protection agency in the U.S. federal government. Currently, there are over 200 field offices around the United States and over 10,000 employees. It's a scientific, regulatory, and public health agency. It has all those functions, and it has jurisdiction over most food products, other than meat and poultry, which is housed under the under USDA. Also, human and animal drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, and animal feed. All right. So the FDA evaluates applications for new drugs and biologics, certain medical devices, food and color additives, and all those sorts of things. It monitors the manufacture, import, transport, storage, and sale of products. It does have inspection functions, and it is arguably largely reactive. And in that way, meaning that something bad might happen, or they'll go in and have to inspect, and there isn't a lot of proactive steps being taken, and that was one of the reasons for the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2011. So we'll talk about that as we move through. But first, we're going to get into some of the history and why we even have the FDA and how this all works. So the organization, historically being driven by this public demand over poisonous products. As you can see, there's a picture of snake oil and a lack of product consistency, safety concerns, people not really knowing what's going into their products. Originally, the FDA was called the Division of Chemistry, Bureau of Chemistry, and then it moved into the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, and then finally in 1930 it was the FDA as we kind of know it in terms of the Food and Drug Administration. So right now it's housed in the Department of Health and Human Services, although it used to be housed under the Department of Agriculture and then was transferred multiple times. The current organization of the FDA, there's an Office of the Commissioner and then 4 directorates that oversee core functions of the agency, which include medical products and tobacco, foods, global regulatory operations and policy, and then operations. So we're going to talk a little bit about the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. So this arose due to public education and these exposés, some of these muckrakers, probably the most famous being Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, although that had to do a little bit more with the meat packing industry. But people really becoming more and more aware that their products were not necessarily safe. And really wanting a federal law that has that's focusing on regulating foods and other types of products. So in 1906, this was the first federal law regulating foods and drugs moving in interstate commerce. Interstate commerce being things that travel between the states. The basis of this law was really regulating the product labeling versus the pre-market approval. So that was back in 1906. Subsequent public health crises spurred on further action. So some of them are mascara that causes blindness and cancer. This is the lash lux, which would dye people's eyelashes, ended up having people go blind. At least one known person that went blind from this particular product. A pediatric sulfa wonder drug that was actually made of antifreeze with over 100 children dying as a result. Tonics that cause death. And then the Wilhite exhaler, which was the cure for diabetes and tuberculosis, ended up being more harmful than helpful. Actually, in 1906, there was more of a focus on food, and then in 1912, more of an effort to do drug regulation. And this is because changing individuals within the agency and what people really viewed as harmful. So 1906, this really paved the way for the FDA, although it's really the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that was the watershed U.S. food policy. Food was considered misbranded if it represented itself as a standardized food and then didn't conform to that standard. So this is really talking about those pre-market approval for new drugs, prohibiting false claims. Like I said before, the basis for the 1906 law was really looking at regulation of product labeling versus pre-market approval. So now we're going into pre-market approval. Correcting abuses in food packaging and quality, and mandating legally enforceable food standards. So some of those food standards being definitions and identity, what the quality of the food is, and the fill of container. There are also tolerance standards for certain poisonous detrimental substances. Some of those would be including heroin and cocaine. Authorized inspections and added injunctions to the agency's arsenal. So the agency was allowed to go in and formally address facility inspections, which is something that they currently do today. So just a little bit more history. Going into some of the first food standards, those were for canned tomatoes. And then we're looking at amendments and additions to the 1938 Act and focusing more on food technology really changing when we're thinking about the 50s and the 60s. So recipe standards, which mean the list of ingredients that can lawfully be included in a product. Then we're also talking about laws addressing pesticide residues, food additives, color additives. When you're thinking about the types of foods that are being offered, more prepackaged, and you're doing a tighter control over the growing list of chemicals that are entering into the food supply. So as a result, there are going to be amendments and additions to this act that are going to address some of those alterations in food. The onus is really on the manufacturers to establish this safety. There's also a ban of carcinogenic additives. I always say that word incorrectly. And agency actions against food misbranding, so false nutritional claims and unscientific enrichment claims. And then looking at vitamin fortification and dietary supplements in the 70s, that really becoming kind of more of an issue and the amendments that go along with that. Also vitamins and minerals. So if we're going to talk about recent history, drugs and devices get most of the attention from the FDA. One of the notable exceptions includes Mad Cow. But they do recalls, monitoring, they look at generics for drugs, cigarette litigation, and then increased attention to dietary supplements that step over the line in terms of what they are saying is included. We're looking at organic, natural, healthy, and free-range types of foods, and that's becoming more of an issue. And then renewed focus on food production standards, and manufacturing issues. That's just some of our history on the FDA, provide a little background for what we're going to be talking about here, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act. We also want to talk about the jurisdictional overlap and coordination between agencies, both at the federal level and then state and local agency kinds of structures. So as we know, the USDA is responsible for regulating meat products, except the FDA does have oversight over products that are not necessarily as traditional, the way I like to think of them, so like elk, rabbit, things like that. So those are meat products that actually fall within the purview of the FDA as opposed to USDA. Then we have the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. And, you know, there are some memorandums of understanding between both the FDA and the ATF about what goes into certain products, alcohol being something that is mostly under ATF. We have the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FTC, and then a variety of other health and human services agencies. There's also that jurisdictional overlap and coordination between state departments and the FDA, and local sometimes, but that depends really on the agency structure. So as I mentioned before, the FDA really having jurisdiction over products that are in interstate commerce, which will be a lot of products, but there are things, particularly in food, that are intrastate commerce, which means they don't travel across state lines. So now we're really going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was signed into law in January 2011. And really the impetus for signing this was the public health imperative, foodborne illness being a significant burden, with about 48 million Americans, which is 1 in 6, getting sick every year, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die. Also talking about immunocompromised individuals being more susceptible, and thinking about foodborne illness not just being a stomach ache alone, that it can cause these lifelong chronic diseases such as arthritis or kidney failure, which was one of the reasons that the FDA really wanted to we wanted to focus more on shifting into a more preventative control across the food supply, and this is what the Food Safety Modernization Act really did. So it's aiming to protect public health by ensuring the safety and security of the food supply on the front end, being less reactionary, arguably, and attempting to focus more on preventing food safety problems. Subsequent regulations implement the FSMA and react to the recent outbreaks of foodborne illness, and this is working in tandem with industry efforts. One of the things about the Food Safety Modernization Act is it does grant the FDA some more jurisdiction. One of the things that we might want to consider is that domestic facilities for the first time have to register regardless of whether their food enters into interstate commerce, which is something that I just talked about in terms of jurisdiction. So all these domestic facilities have to register. And then recently, and I don't know, I'm sure people might have followed this in terms of the FDA suspending Sunland Incorporated, which is the producer of nuts and seed spreads. Sorry, they suspended their registration, and this was the first time that they used this. This was back in November of 2011. They used it under Section 102 of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so Sunland is prohibited from introducing its products into both interstate or intrastate commerce. And the suspension order states that no person can introduce any food made at a Sunland facility into commerce in the United States, or offer to import or export any food that came from a Sunland facility, which is in Portales, New Mexico. So that was something that's kind of interesting. It's really broadening some of the, sorry, my Ready Talk just disappeared. I don't know where it went. There it is. Okay. So really broadening what the FDA can do. So one of the things about the Food Safety Modernization Act is there are 5 new rule publications that actually implement the Act. So what I want to talk a little bit about here is notice and comment rulemaking. So when the FDA goes through, they have to, right now there are 5 new rule publications that are going to implement the Act, and this is produce safety, preventative controls for human food, and then we're going to be on the lookout for importer and foreign supplier verification, preventative controls for animal food, and accreditation of third-party auditors. And today we're really going to focus on the produce safety. One of the things about the rulemaking process is that rulemaking is open and public, meaning that there's a notice and comment period. So before a proposed rule is published in the Federal Register, and that's where people can go look for these rules for public comment. So the President and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs will analyze a draft when the rules are significant enough due to economic effects or because they raise important policy issues. And then they're going to estimate the cost and benefit of the rules and consider different types of solutions. And then once the proposed rule goes into play, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is the official document that's going to announce and explain the agency's plan to address a problem or accomplish a goal. And so all these rules have to be published in the Federal Registrar and notify the public and give them an opportunity to submit comments. So in general, agencies will specify how long a comment period can be. They can range from 30 to 60 days, or they can go for 180 days or more if they're going to be for more complex rulemakings. They can also shorten the comment period if they have a justifiable reason. So during the comment period, the agency can hold these public hearings where people can make statements, submit data, and essentially what they're trying to do is get as much information as possible in order to incorporate that into the rule. And the notice and comment process allows anyone to submit a comment on any part of the proposed rule. And then at the end of the process, the agency has to base its reasoning and conclusions on the rulemaking record. And that consists of comments, scientific data, expert opinions, and facts that have been accumulated during both the pre-rule and proposed rule stages. And so what you ultimately see rolling out in a rule is everything that they've gotten in that entire time. So one thing to note is if that rulemaking record does have persuasive new data or policy arguments or difficult kinds of questions or criticisms, the agency can decide to terminate the rulemaking or continue the rulemaking but change aspects of the rule to reflect some of these new issues. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of these rules being rolled out under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Is we're in a notice and comment rulemaking stage with people in the public being able to submit their comments. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Lindsay take it from here to go into some of these proposed rules, starting with produce safety.
Thanks, Erica. There we go. If at any point you can't see my slides move, please someone let me know. So I first read these two sets of rules when they came out in January. If any of you tried recently to go pull them from the FDA website or even to go back to the register, you may have had an interesting time with that because they were actually pulled back and are supposed to be reissued today. And the reason for that is that there were a number of rules with the cross-references. So they would send you to one section, you would go to the section, and it wouldn't exist. Fairly common when agencies are trying to roll out rules to meet a deadline. In this case, these rules were over a year late from the deadline that had been previously imposed. And so take it or leave it. Eventually we should be able to see them again. The substance should not change. I just have a few comments to add to what Erica said about her administrative law overview for notice and comment rulemaking. This rulemaking was a little bit different from what you might see in terms of a CMS rulemaking, for example. The agency went out quite a while ago and started doing regulated party surveys and doing more of the scientific and technical evidence gathering than often happens before they roll out rulemaking. So if you are ever unfortunate enough to go through and read, say, the first 50 pages of the publication, there's quite a bit of historical information in there that in part is supposed to guide them, and so they've provided that to the industry. And if you have comments, if you want to chime in on this, if you like it or don't like it, that's one place to go and say, okay, this is what the agency was basing this on, and then sometimes your comments have more weight if you can demonstrate that you've read that background material, you can rebut it, you can agree with it, etc. This set of rules is supposed to address some of the routes the agency has identified as being common for contamination. So the rule addresses agricultural water, biological soil amendments of animal origin, health and hygiene for workers and those coming into contact with the produce, animals in the growing area. That can be either animals who wander in, animals that regularly graze in the area, or animals used in the produce harvest process. This last part, equipment, tools, and buildings, gets at what you use to harvest, what you use to plant, what you use to sort or pack, and things like how often you have to clean it, what kind of condition it has to be kept in, etc. A lot of this will sound very common sense, and a lot of it will sound very vague. There are perhaps good reasons for that and bad reasons for that. In part, it may keep some lawyers busy, I suppose, and cause some headaches for regulated parties, but the FDA's justification is that part of the reason for what sounds like vagueness is flexibility for farms to meet the requirements in a way that works for them and has the same level of safety without being overly burdensome. We'll see how that turns out, for better or for worse. Here we are. This rule covers produce, i.e. fruits and vegetables grown for human consumption. We're not worried about animal consumption in this rule. It deals with both the commodity, that is the raw agricultural commodity, and the practices associated with growing, harvesting, packing, and holding, and it's really based on the farm. As I mentioned, it gives some grower flexibility, but if this does not involve a farm, if some practice does not involve a farm, then this rule will not apply. It will not apply to off-farm locations for any of these activities. If you have a mixed type facility that's doing something covered under this rule and something not covered under this rule, there are some proposals in the preamble and in the rules themselves that say, well, only the activities that are covered need to comply with this rule, but you're going to have to segregate the food so that we don't have mingling. And that's something that they have specifically solicited comment about. There are a number of limitations in the rule itself. It exempts what they call low-risk produce. Here, the agency went ahead of time and did a survey of growers. They also say they surveyed consumers to look at what kinds of foods are rarely consumed raw, such that they would go through another process that would reduce contamination, make risk of illness low, etc. And there are actually statistics in the preamble and in some other sections that talk about the percentage of the population they think that, for example, consumes a sweet potato raw. I tell you, I've never done that. Someone maybe has, but they're saying, you know, this is reliably low, that we don't need to impose this burden on those produce growers. In addition, their common example in the rule is green beans, for example. Green beans, if they're being canned, we don't need to worry about it. There will be a kill step later. That's not what we're dealing with here. This rule also does not apply to produce grown for personal or on-farm consumption. This is even further away from interstate commerce. This is produce never leaving the farm at all. Lastly, there is a carve-out for the smallest farms. And the FDA has asked for comment on how these size categories should be defined. Here they've proposed an average annual value of food sold during the previous 3-year period of $25,000, that's an extra zero, $25,000 or less. But they've asked, is this right? Is this the right size? Should it be a different size? And that's one thing with this rulemaking. They have a lot of very specific questions to regulated parties, and in general, they're less specific in their question gathering process. They just throw it out there and say, what do you think? This is much more targeted. They specifically want to know what you think about the size. There are partial exemptions. In this one, we have another category. This is $500,000 or less, and all of these are adjusted for inflation. Sales to qualified end users must exceed sales to others during the same period. Qualified end user is generally what you might expect. A consumer could be, this could be across state lines. A restaurant, retail, food establishment in the same state as the farm, or not more than 275 miles from the farm. The FDA has given themselves the authority in the rules to take away a partial exemption, and the partial exemption really lessens the compliance burden, but they can pull that if they decide that a farm is linked to an outbreak or it's necessary to protect public health. This might come about if a state or local health department were to conduct an investigation, start looking at incident reports, and say, we've tracked such that we want to report this incident to this farm. At that point, the FDA can pull the exemption. They can also pull exemptions later on if you have a bad compliance history in their mind, or if for some reason there's been a scuffle about your records. So this is somewhat nebulous right now, and it may not stay in the final rule at all. It may be that the FDA has more authority to pull partial exemptions. It's something they're asking for comment about. One of the new rules that we hint to on the cover slide has to do with labeling. So partial exemptions reduce the compliance burden. However, they don't do away with labeling requirements. So if a label would otherwise be required, then there has to be a label on the produce with the name and address of the farm. If no label would generally be required, if you're partially exempt, then you still have to show the name and address of the farm displayed at the point of purchase. I think I lost that should have said via a poster as one example. And this will also go later towards some of the FDA's regulation over recalls for food and what kind of notice you have to give. It's intended to identify farms specifically and reduce some of the negative associations that may flow over to one farm when it really wasn't their fault. Perhaps they were in a particular region. And so that's what this is getting at. The next slide we have here is dealing with agricultural water. If you are a water person, the rules will probably be very interesting to you. If you're not a water person, it's a little mind-numbing because some of us aren't as familiar with all of the testing options. The rules are pretty vague about it, but with respect to ag water, the rules say that it has to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for intended use. I read that, and I think that is really vague. It's really flexible. What does adequate mean in certain contexts? How does that vary with intended use? That's something that the agency is not only soliciting comment on, but expecting farms to look at that requirement, assess their situation, come up with a plan, and then be prepared to support their choices with their documentation. This ag water includes water that is intended to or is likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. There are inspection requirements that will be required at the beginning of the growing season and then periodically throughout. And again, the frequency of testing and the types of testing depend on the type of produce you're growing, your schedule for harvest, also whether you treat the water. If your water comes from, for example, a public well, then a lot of this doesn't apply to you. So it depends on the type of water you're using, where it's coming from, and what you know about it. It's meant to reduce the I'm watering with water, I don't know what's in it, and we're just going to keep going factor. Just a reminder, if anyone has a conversation or something, if you could please mute. I think it's been pretty quiet, but I'll throw that out there. Biological soil amendments of animal origin. This is a really fancy way of saying that you might use something to help your produce grow, and they talk about any type of animal waste being used in application. A biological soil amendment does not cover any human waste, and the rules expressly say you may not use human waste unless you're dealing with a biotreated sludge that meets other FDA requirements. So here we're just talking about essentially animal fertilizer. The rules talk about how you can apply, what you can apply, how frequently, how much time you have to wait between application and when you can harvest. And they're not specific in terms of you must wait 10 days, you must wait 5 days. They're saying you, farm, have to make a decision based on your growing. This is appropriate, this is not appropriate, etc. With respect to the handling and storage, this rule says that we can't store our biological soil amendments when we're not using them. in such a manner that they're going to contaminate produce. We can't, for example, dump it in a pile in the corner and leave it there. We need to look at what are you using, how are you storing it, is it appropriate, is there a risk of runoff contamination, how should this be kept secure, etc. Again, vague depending on your situation. Thank you to Erica for the fun pictures here. This is one of those things that feels very common sense, but if you've spent any time on certain grow farms, you know that access to hand washing facilities and bathrooms can be a challenge. This rule is saying there needs to be adequate hand washing, there needs to be personal cleanliness. If you are sick, and they give some delightful examples of sicknesses you might have, that can't come into contact with the produce. You have to have bathroom facilities. There has to be toilet paper in the bathroom facilities. And it's partly funny to read that in the rules and partly very not funny. It aims to reduce person-to-person and person-to-food transmission, particularly via the fecal-oral route. And they go into a little bit more detail here than they do in the other sections, because I think in their mind there are some more objective standards for what we expect from hand washing. Essentially the rule says if you've left, if something's happened, if you've gone to the bathroom, you need to wash your hands. It talks about when you need to wash your hands when you're dealing with gloves on and off, etc. And in general, don't let your open wounds come into contact with the produce. This next section on animals also has a fair amount of detail. It deals with both domesticated and wild. So domesticated being your cows, horses, etc., and the wild animals you're not in control of. It also talks, for example, about guide dogs and guard dogs. It says that there has to be an adequate waiting period. Again, this would depend on the type of produce you're growing, temperature, whether it's rained, what kind of contamination there might be. So an adequate waiting period between grazing of domesticated animals and then your subsequent harvest in the growing area. If you're using a working animal, farms have to take measures to prevent pathogens from being introduced onto the produce. Again, they're going to leave that in part up to you, although they'll take suggestions. It depends on the type of crop involved and the type of animal. And now farms have to monitor for significant wild animal intrusion, i.e., a flock of something terrible, a herd of something breaks through the fence and runs amok around your field. You have to look for that. And if it's bad enough or close enough to harvest, you're not allowed to harvest your produce if it's visibly contaminated. Again, those are judgment calls that farms will have to make, but the critical part is that they have documentation in their records, which they now have to keep for 2 years, I believe, that documents their choice and supports it. It's not that the FDA is saying there's one right choice, although certainly the guidance is leaning towards the cautious approach and the think twice, think three times approach, but mostly they want to see that there was reasoned decision-making based on scientific evidence, and scientific evidence will vary depending on the growing location, the produce, the type of farm, their operations, etc. This next slide deals with equipment, tools, and buildings. There are a number of new standards for growing equipment. They talk about harvesting equipment, sorting equipment, packing and holding equipment. It has to be cleaned at the beginning of the season and then periodically throughout. It has to be inspected. All that has to be documented. The rules talk about, for example, let's say there is a seam in one part of a piece of equipment where two pieces come together. That either needs to be smooth, i.e. we could talk about it being welded together. We could talk about some kind of gap filler. Or it needs to be regularly cleaned so that there's not buildup and potential for contamination there. This is really meant to address not that you can't take equipment from one type of operation, put it into another, but even if you do that, you need to look at it, you need to clean it, you need to inspect it. It needs to be capable of being cleaned on a regular basis. It can't be something that if you clean it, you can't actually reach half of it, and so that there is then a reservoir of contamination. That's what this is getting at. It also talks about standing water issues in buildings. Talks about drains. We can't have standing water. Your drain needs to work. You need to inspect your drain. Again, a lot of the details here will vary based on the type of equipment that a particular farm has. My expectation is that farms with financial resources will probably hire consultants. They'll bring in auditors who are hopefully qualified to deal with this, and hopefully with some sort of certification that we'll be talking about later. But they'll be looking for expert guidance, or they'll be getting it from their local trade organization. They may also be getting it from a statewide farm association, depending on what kind of operation they have and how big the market is in the area for what they produce. There are specific sections in the rules that deal with sprouts. If you're very into sprouts, I suggest you go read them. In short, it talks a lot about treating the seed before sprouting, testing irrigation water for pathogens, and continuing to monitor the growing environment. Training is also on here as an odds and ends piece because it doesn't really fit anywhere else. But this is supposed to deal with training for farm personnel to educate them about contamination, transmission, how to deal with handling produce and food contact surfaces, discussing things like how long should something be immersed in cold water? Is that appropriate for this type of produce? Again, hand washing training, as well as training for supervisors. And I should mention that that training will have to be documented in the records. And just in case you were wondering, all of those records need to be accessible and open to the FDA, like you would expect for most oversight agencies. If they are stored off-site, they have to be back to the farm so that the FDA could access them within 24 hours. It's a fairly quick turnaround time. I think the reality is that for most moderate-sized farms, things will be stored on-site or in an area close by. This slide deals with alternatives, which is something the FDA appears to be very proud of. It says in the rulemaking that farms may establish alternatives to certain requirements. Not all requirements, but some of them. And the alternative that you establish has to provide the same amount of protection without increasing the risk of adulterated food. Adulterated food is what the Act prohibits, and most of the penalties in the Act deal with adulterated food. So if you propose an alternative, you need to be prepared to back it up and say that the information you have supports this alternative. It could be information specific to your growing area. It could be information from your growers association, but you're going to have to be prepared to go to bat to support what you've proposed. There are also variance procedures in place for a state or foreign country to request a variance if necessary in light of local conditions. Again, this is not a mechanism to lower the bar for safety or consumer protection. It's a mechanism by which the FDA is saying this rulemaking, the backbone of this rulemaking is scientific evidence and using that to promote public health. So if you can come up with something and it supports what you're saying and we buy this argument, then you can go ahead and use that if we approve it. They have given some rules, proposed rules about how the variance process would work. They're asking for comment on that. My suspicion is that this could be very difficult to administer. I don't know that this will survive very long, and we'll see how it's tested. But if you know much about the FDA, there's not too many folks out there in the field, first of all, who could come and check on something. There's not that many folks who have a lot of time lying around to process variance standards, and there's not very many opportunities for budget increases or new hiring events. So I'm a little skeptical about how this alternatives option will roll out, but we'll wait and see. The rule has a number of compliance dates. So the rule itself will be effective 60 days after a final rule is published. Again, these are the proposed rules. So after they go through the notice and comment process, people write back. Then the agency has to take those comments, like Erica mentioned, and respond to them, generally collectively or specifically, depending on the type of comment. Sometimes they group them together. Sometimes they treat them separately. But after they've done that, considered it, figured out what they're going to do, if they do in fact decide to publish a final rule, then this will kick in 60 days after. However, the compliance dates are really going to vary based on the size of the farm at issue. And again, they're asking for comments as to whether this is an accurate matrix for sizes. But you can see here, usually the water requirements are more delayed, and you'll see that and some other rules coming down the pipe, I'm sure. We're looking at $250,000, $500,000, and then if you're everyone else, you're going to have 2 years. I think the emphasis here is that none of this can happen overnight, particularly training pieces, compliance plans. If you really need to change your ag water system, that's not fast and that's not cheap. This is their attempt to give compliance rollout times. However, I expect that there will be a fair amount of comments about this timeline. In the proposed draft or notice they originally published calling for regulated party comments and soliciting information when they were in their fact-gathering stage, there was a lot of disagreement here. A fair number of consumer groups felt that this should all be effective immediately. And as you might expect, a number of farms said, this is way too fast. So we'll see what happens. It does feel somewhat arbitrary. With federal rulemaking, as with most state rulemaking efforts, there is an economic impact or fiscal impact analysis. The FDA is careful to say that they believe that most foodborne illnesses those numbers are underreported, and most of our knowledge from state and local public health efforts would back that up. So they're working with the universe of the reports that they have. The FDA draws that data, in this case from the CDC. They're looking at approximately 1.75 million illnesses being prevented with an associated benefit of $1.04 billion annually. And looking at a cost of compliance, you can see there are $459.56 million for domestic farms and less than that for foreign farms because there are fewer foreign farms in their analysis. The proposed rule covers 40,000 and a little bit more domestic and then about 15,000 foreign farms. They estimate that about 75,000 farms will be partially exempt but still subject to labeling. So we talked about the labeling issue, trying to let consumers know where their food is coming from and to reduce negative associations that may come about from an outbreak, a contamination event, so that a whole industry doesn't tank. The FDA estimates that 34,000 approximate farms will be totally exempt from all of this, and they think that 90% of the produce grown and consumed by Americans will be either covered by this proposed rule or sent to further processing. By that they mean either it will go on to a kill step by canning, for example, or it will go through manufacturing and be subject to a slightly different set of rules if it was an off-farm process, but there's still regulation there. So this 90% number doesn't tell you very much, but I think they think it looks good, and it is somewhat encouraging. This is the end of the first rule. I'm going to take a moment here to pause and say that I want to touch a little bit about what Erica said on interstate versus intrastate commerce. So it's true that the FDA traditionally can only regulate items that are in interstate commerce, i.e. between the states, and by that we mean using channels of interstate commerce, moving, so you could talk about trucking, you could talk about using roads going across state lines, the internet sometimes, etc. The FDA recognizes that raw agricultural commodities of the type targeted by this rulemaking do not always move in interstate commerce. And portions of this rulemaking are designed to target foods that never will and are never intended to. It's a bit of a jurisdictional shift. And sometimes in our past Supreme Court history, going back quite a ways, the courts have been okay with that. Because, for example, a product that never leaves the state and is never intended to leave the state could influence a larger market. There could be channels of commerce there. One example is wheat. So the FDA has recognized in its rulemaking that this may not fly. So we don't really know what will happen. In general, the trend in recent past has been to reduce the far reach of the Commerce Clause. In the past, governments have used that to regulate almost anything because there's not a whole lot we do that doesn't affect interstate commerce. But slowly, in recent past, courts have been pulling that in, especially at the high level. So your guess is as good as mine as to what might happen with this, and the FDA has recognized that that's a question mark for them, and they've highlighted that specifically and done a brief Commerce Clause analysis in the rulemaking effort. That's probably only interesting to you if you're an admin law nut, but I thought I would raise that. With that, I think, Erica, should we turn it over to questions now?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, just so everyone knows, the subsequent slides that you'll deal with, I'll show it right here. The proposed rule for preventive controls for human food. This is dealing with mostly the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Also very vague, but requiring farms to go through a lot more process to identify hazards at the outset instead of being perhaps quite so reactive and looking at what's probable or possible and what's a reasonable step. So those are those slides. We'll go back to this one, and if anyone has any questions, you can either ask them on the phone or you can type them in the chat. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you for joining the webinar, by the way. No one at all. Perhaps we put you to sleep with the rules. Anyone? Anyone? Erica, anything you want to add?
Lindsay, I have a question. Seeing as they had the...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself to the group, please?
I'm sorry, this is Melanie Staponi. Seeing as the information was posted and they pulled it, are they going to, and I know you wouldn't know this possibly, but are they going to repost with the same information, or was it being pulled for editing?
Good question. So I read, whenever they do this, they have to publish a notice that they're pulling something back for technical edits, and they have to make a list of the errors they've identified that they're going to correct. So that's what I would expect to see. I wouldn't expect to see substantive changes.
Thank you.
Sure, and particularly with respect to cross-references. If you tried to read the rules, it would send you to certain sections within the rulemaking itself and certain sections within the Act that didn't always match up, and that just happens when you're rolling out a new rulemaking product. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Rick Vogt, Tri-County Health Department. How are you guys? Thanks for a very nice presentation.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
The cost of compliance is listed there at just shy of $460 million. That seems awfully low. I'm not so sure with all the things that they are outlining that, in fact, farms can actually comply with things with that particular figure. I'm just wondering how they came up with that, and in fact, it may be a reverse cost-benefit ratio if, in fact, the costs are clearly higher than the $1.04 billion annually that is supposed to be saved with the foodborne illnesses prevented. Any insight into this?
This is Lindsay. I can chime in on some of that. So when they give you that associated benefit number, that's after they've taken into account the cost of the illnesses, and they've looked at the cost of compliance, and in their mind, the difference is 1.04 saved. Now, I recognize that that number is hard to believe, particularly when you look at the costs of changing a water system. I think that part of their assumption is that a number of growers in a number of states are already held to higher standards, either through who they sell to or their state association. So, for example, if they sell to a certain grocery store chain, they have required higher standards already. if they're already in compliance with a different state requirement. So that's in there. It's also, I think, a recognition that not every farm does all of the covered activities. For example, not every farm will have compliance issues. I don't know what that noise is. Someone could mute that, that'd be great. Not every farm will have harvesting, packing, holding, etc. functions. That spectrum will be shorter. That's the tough sound. Sorry guys, I don't want to do it. On hold, please take it off. And then I think the issue with the water system is that they think that it will be easier to comply than it may be. My concern is not so much with the training costs, but what it will cost to change a water system and the testing equipment. Who really growers are going to be able to go to and say, are you qualified to help us with this? I think there's a lot of unknowns. I agree with you that it's worth it to be skeptical about the compliance costs. And in part, we'll just have to see what people write back with in terms of their evidence and say your number is completely bogus. I think the other thing that the FDA is counting on is the burden will be somewhat lessened. Farms phase in their costs over a number of years. So for example, if you have 6 years to comply with something and we do one piece of it 1 year and then we keep going and we spread that out, it might not be so bad. But I think your point is a very valid one. Erica, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I think you did a good job of summarizing that, and then a little bit of it was lost in translation to me because the music was playing. But
sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, sorry, guys. But I think Lindsay really described that well.
Thank you for your question. I think that was very helpful. Does anyone have any other questions? If there are no others, then I think I'll close by saying you'll be receiving a survey from COSOPHE that we would very much appreciate if you would fill out. It's voluntary, but we enjoy having feedback on webinars. We hope to continue to do several more in the future. Erica and I are planning one on junk food syntaxes and related bans, i.e. we're going to talk about what's happened recently in New York and with some litigation there. If you signed up for CHES credit, you will be receiving a separate CHES evaluation, and you should be familiar with how that process works. But if not, please feel free to contact us. I will send out the slides shortly. Thank you very much for your time and for supporting our organizations, and we're pleased that you joined, and we hope to work with you again in the future with more webinars and more education opportunities. Erica, anything else to close with?
Just thank you guys for calling in. We really appreciate it. And then also just as a side note, once the final rules have been put into place, the FDA has said that it's going to try to help provide farms technical assistance to comply with these produce safety requirements, and that they're trying to build a national network to provide that technical assistance, and that's currently under development. So that was just a little side note that even once the final rules roll out, that's not the end of the day. The FDA has said that they're committed to helping some of these farms comply. So that's just something else. But thank you guys all for calling in. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you learned a lot about the FDA and the new Food Safety Modernization Act.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day. So sign off. Bye.
Bye. Lindsay, are you still on?
Thank you. Please stand by.